I went to dinner with my parents at the restaurant we'd always frequented, those moments when everything seemed to align with the tranquility of routine, the familiar faces, the waiter who knew us by name, the favorite dishes chosen almost without thought. I was there, smiling, telling a silly joke, when I looked to the side and saw a scene that took my breath away. My wife. Sitting at the table with another man. Not a friend, not a relative. The boss. The man I'd noticed all too often in her conversations, that name that came up every now and then, always as someone demanding, someone she needed to impress. But it wasn't his name that gave me the breakthrough. It was the touch. The way she leaned in, the way her smile was different, lighter, more intimate. The world spun in slow motion for a few seconds. I stood up, walked toward them, and saw something in her eyes I'll never forget, fear. It wasn't guilt. It was the fear of being caught. She froze. As if time had stopped between us. I said, in a low, hard voice, controlling every syllable, "What are you doing? You come here to dinner with your boss and you don't tell me anything. My parents are at the next table watching all this. I hope you can explain something." The boss, unsure where to hide his face, swallowed hard and tried to mumble something, but I ignored him. I stared only at her. And I saw the exact moment she realized the enormity of her mistake. Shame spread across her face like a wine stain on white fabric. But what came next was worse. Not the scandal, I didn't make a fuss. I returned to the table, finished my glass of wine as if nothing had happened, swallowed the stone-dry dinner, and kissed my mother on the forehead. When I got home, I waited. 2 hours. 3. 4. She didn't come back. The clock was almost 4 in the morning when I grabbed a pen, left the divorce decree on the table, along with the rings, and left. Without making a fuss. Without making a fuss. Just. I went. I hit the road as if I were driving away from a lifetime. And I was. A new city, an empty room, silence. But I carried with me the weight of every moment shared with her. The birthdays. The nights of conversation. The trips. The way she used to sleep facing me. Everything. I also carried the weight of what I didn't notice. The nights when she'd be late arriving and I'd blame it on traffic. The postponed dinners. The increasingly long silences. I believed she needed space. She just needed another man. Months passed. And it was there, in the new city, among unpacked boxes and an apartment smelling of fresh paint, that I began to relearn how to live. Little by little, I caught my breath, looking at myself in the mirror with less anger. I reconnected with who I was before I was a husband. Before I was betrayed. Before I sacrificed myself for love. I met new people. A new routine. And, eventually, a new woman. But that came later. Because the pain, above all, needed to be felt. And it was. In every lonely dawn, in every silent meal, in every night I woke thinking she was by my side. Meanwhile, she found herself alone. Because what seemed like a new world for her, the world of status, seduction, recognition, began to empty itself. She realized, drop by drop, that touch of the hand at the restaurant table wasn't worth what she'd lost. That the man who smiled at her that night didn't know her fears, her quirks, her way of laughing. She traded true love for a game of vanity. And when the game was over, nothing remained but her own reflection. She discovered she might have even won a fancy dinner, but she lost the late-night cuddles, the shared silences, the embraces on cold nights. And it was when she tried to return, when she finally understood the depth of the hole she'd dug, that she realized it was already too late. She sought me out. She discovered the city. She texted. She called. She showed up at the new address. I saw her from afar. The same face, now tired. The same look, but dull. I didn't need to say anything. The silence was enough. She understood. She understood that love, when betrayed, doesn't return. It may even be forgiven, but it will never be the same. Her time was up. And mine had finally begun. She cried. She asked for my forgiveness. She said it was just that one time, that she couldn't handle the pressure, that she lost herself. She talked about missing me, about what we'd been through, about the plans we had. I listened to everything. In silence. Because what I had to say, she already knew. Her love died the moment she chose another lap. And mine was reborn the moment I had the courage to leave. She wanted to understand why I no longer looked at her the way I used to, why my tone was cold, why there was someone else by my side. And all I could think was, because now, I've learned the value of a love that doesn't deceive. But what perhaps destroyed her most wasn't the end of her marriage. It was discovering that the betrayal wasn't just against me. It was against herself. Everything she claimed to be, faithful, loyal, committed, a woman of values, went up in smoke. The betrayal ripped away her very identity. She looked in the mirror and didn't recognize herself. She traded love for an adventure. Security for an illusion. And when the charm wore off, only the echo of her own choice remained. She tried to rebuild her life. But something was broken. Something that no longer holds together. He tried new relationships, but others never trusted him like I did. She tried going out with friends, but the image of that dinner, of the moment she saw me in front of her, still haunted her. He tried to pretend everything was fine. But the truth, that damned truth, always came back. In the early hours. Silently. When no one sees. Because the greatest punishment isn't the end of love. It's continuing to live after destroying it. And now, perhaps, she wonders every day, if she had been honest that night, if she had called me before leaving with him, if she had looked me in the eye and told me something was wrong, would we still be together? But life isn't built on ifs. It's built on choices. And she chose. And so did I. I moved on. She stayed behind. But the question that never goes away, and that perhaps one day will need to be answered, is, what would have happened if, that night, she had returned home? What if I had waited another hour? Or did she get there first? Maybe everything would be different. Or maybe, it was exactly the same. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support, encourage or romanticize any type of cheating. All the stories you hear are fictional, created to show how much infidelity destroys relationships, families, and entire lives. The moral of each story is clear: cheating is never worth it. Get ready now to dive into another intense, realistic and shocking. Sit down, take a deep breath. The story is about to begin. Lucas had always been a man of solid structure, the kind who carries serenity in his eyes and the weight of responsibility on his shoulders without making a fuss. He grew up in a traditional family, surrounded by solid values and few extravagances. His parents, Jorge and Helena, cultivated a quiet marriage over the years, the kind that grows stronger through actions than words. There were no dramatic scenes at home, no grand dinners with speeches of eternal love, but there was presence, fidelity, respect, and, above all, constancy. Lucas absorbed all of this like someone drinking from the source that would shape his own affections and, later, without realizing it, would try to replicate this same relationship model with the woman he had chosen for his life, Clara. Clara, on the other hand, was the complementary opposite. An only child of parents separated since childhood, she grew up between disconnected homes and affections. Her cold and calculating mother always taught her that stability was an illusion, and that love was a resource to be used, or discarded, as convenient. Her father, an absentee, preferred to rebuild his life in another state and keep his daughter at a distance, replacing affection with monthly bank deposits and brief phone calls on special occasions. Clara learned early on to protect herself emotionally and to stand out in her surroundings. Intelligent, eloquent, ambitious, and possessing a natural charm that drew attention wherever she went, she always found it easy to build superficial bonds, but immense difficulty in truly giving herself. Lucas and Clara's encounter happened unexpectedly during a lecture on emotional management in the workplace. Lucas had been invited by a psychologist friend, and Clara was there at the request of her company, a multinational that prioritized personal development and interpersonal intelligence. At the end of the event, they bumped into each other on the way out. A book fell out of her bag, and he bent down to pick it up. The conversation that followed was natural and fluid, almost as if they already knew each other. Over the next few days, they exchanged shy messages, then casual coffees, and within a few months, they were living together. Their relationship grew with the elegance of things that seemed too right to go wrong. Lucas was patient, helpful, attentive, and made a point of demonstrating Clara's importance in his life with small gestures. He made her breakfast on weekends, left encouraging notes on the refrigerator door, and knew the subtlest details of her mood, the way she looked when she wanted silence, the lost look in her eyes when she was frustrated, and even the hidden smile when she wanted to hide her discomfort. Clara, contrary to what she expected of herself, gradually allowed herself to be involved. Lucas was the first man who didn't demand masks, who didn't test the limits of her independence or question her ambition. With him, she felt safe, a feeling she'd never known before. The marriage came naturally. Without ostentation, but with beauty. An intimate ceremony, surrounded by sincere friends, and the silent promise of a life that would unfold side by side. Over time, they built their dream apartment together, decorated down to the smallest detail by Clara, who had a keen aesthetic sense and enjoyed feeling that every corner of the house reflected a piece of their history. The routine, however monotonous it might seem to others, was a haven for them. Home-cooked dinners, movies on Saturdays, short trips on holidays, and a shared goal, the idea of having children at the right time, when they were both emotionally ready. Clara had grown up fearful of motherhood, as if repeating her own childhood abandonment pattern were inevitable. Lucas respected that timing. He never pressured, never demanded. He said he would much rather have a child when she was certain of it, than rush something that should have been the fruit of love and dedication, not anxiety. In the eyes of most, they were the perfect couple. And for a while, they even seemed so. The neighborhood adored them. They were polite, discreet, and always together at social events. In the condominium, everyone commented on what an exemplary husband Lucas was and what a strong, beautiful, and admirably poised woman Clara was. Among their friends, they were role models. Those who had already gone through divorces or failed relationships looked at them with a certain kind of envy, as if their connection were too rare to last forever. And, indeed, there was chemistry, a sincere complicity. But there were also silences. Small pockets of doubt that grew subtly in the spaces between conversations. Lucas worked at an architecture firm and spent part of the day away, but he made a point of returning early whenever he could. He prioritized being present, knowing that time was a valuable currency. Clara, for her part, continued her professional trajectory. She gained recognition, climbed important ladders, and became increasingly indispensable in her field. However, along with her advancement came absences. Frequent travel, dinners with co-workers, meetings after hours, unanswered messages. Lucas understood. He knew how important this was to her and was proud of her achievements, even when he missed her. But there were times when he found himself staring at the empty side of the bed and feeling a tightness in his chest. Not because he suspected anything, but because he missed the woman with whom he shared plans. He missed the nighttime conversations about the future, the simple jokes over dinner, the knowing glances over trivial matters. Clara was there, but at the same time, she seemed increasingly distant. Always in a hurry, always solving something, always with her gaze fixed on something other than himself. Lucas tried not to harbor this feeling. He attributed it to the phase, the stress, the external demands. And he tried to compensate with even more affection, more care, more patience. Clara, for her part, felt an unease she couldn't name. It wasn't unhappiness. It was something more subtle, like a void that grew when professional achievements no longer filled her as they once did. Sometimes she'd look in the mirror and wonder what else was missing. She had a loving husband, a beautiful home, a prestigious job. But some days, I felt like all that wasn't enough. And this feeling made her feel guilty, because I knew any woman in her position would consider herself fulfilled. So I swallowed the discomfort and moved on, without sharing it. Lucas began to observe her more closely. He noticed how slow she was to smile. How restless she was. How she avoided looking at him for long periods of time. And yet, he remained by her side like a pillar. He prepared her favorite meals when he knew she would arrive exhausted. He took care of everything around the house so she wouldn't have to worry. And, in lighter moments, he still made her laugh with his calm demeanor, his discreet jokes, his quiet tenderness. And it was in this fragile balance between routine and absence that the story began to take shape. The house remained organized, coffee was still served, dinners still existed on weekends. But there was something invisible between them. A glass wall that only one of them could see clearly. Clara carried a weight she didn't yet know how to deal with. A discomfort that grew in her chest without a clear form. And Lucas, even without knowing why, felt that their love was undergoing a silent test, perhaps the greatest they had ever faced. What neither of them could have foreseen was that the seemingly unbreakable bond was about to be cruelly tested. And that the silence between them, long cultivated as a sign of respect and freedom, would actually become the greatest chasm that had ever existed between two hearts. A choice would be made. A line would be crossed. And when the truth finally emerged, neither of them would emerge whole. But even then, there was still love. There were still good memories. There was still, above all, the blind hope that it was all just a phase. Because sometimes the biggest earthquakes begin with small tremors that almost no one notices. And what seems solid, crumbles without warning. The days that followed felt like a strange choreography between two bodies that had once danced together but now moved to different rhythms. Clara grew increasingly distant, and Lucas tried to fill the spaces she left empty with even more intense attention, as if love alone could balance both sides of a relationship. He began waking up before her, and even if he didn't sleep well, he still made coffee with the same care as always. He noticed she ate less, spent more time on her phone, and sometimes left the house with the expression of someone carrying an invisible burden. Lucas didn't ask questions, just watched. Inside him, something was slowly stirring. A silent intuition was beginning to take root. Clara, meanwhile, found herself immersed in a whirlwind she couldn't control. The demands of her job remained demanding, and her sudden rise within the leadership team brought a new set of pressures. She was admired, feared, praised for her results. But at the same time, she felt like a fraud inside. The image she projected in public contrasted with the conflicts growing silently within her. She no longer knew how to clearly express her feelings for Lucas, but she also didn't know how to live without him. His affection touched her, but it no longer warmed her. His presence was constant, but it no longer comforted her. Her world was a construct of achievements and goals, but something essential was missing, and that something, she couldn't name. She sought it in other things. In other perspectives. The meetings with the company's new director, Daniel, began like any other professional relationship. He was confident, charismatic, and strategic. He had the kind of presence that effortlessly fills a room. Unlike Lucas, Daniel was incisive, provocative, and constantly challenging. Clara felt tested and at the same time intrigued by the way he looked at her, as if seeing something others couldn't. Gradually, their exchanges began to transcend professionalism. What initially seemed like mere admiration turned into complicity, then irony, and finally insinuation. Clara initially recoiled. She thought it made no sense. But the truth is, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, excitement. Lucas began to notice her absences. They weren't just physical, but emotional. He spoke, and often, she didn't listen. He touched her arm on the bed and felt her body stiff, as if she were obliged to lie next to someone. He tried not to dramatize. He believed marriages went through phases, and he preferred to believe that. One particular night, he decided to prepare a special dinner at home. He chose her favorite wine, made the dish he'd learned years ago just because she loved it, and set the table with candles. Clara arrived late, excused herself by an extended meeting, and, seeing his effort, tried to appear touched, but there was a shadow in her eyes that Lucas noticed. She smiled, but it didn't last more than a second. The next day, Lucas left for work and forgot his cell phone at home. Clara saw it on the dresser and couldn't resist. She grabbed his phone and was overcome by a strange guilt when she realized there was nothing hidden. No suspicious conversations, no dubious messages, just the pure routine of a man who, unlike her, was transparent. This threw her off balance. How could someone be so faithful, so honest, so available? It was almost unfair. She spent the day restless, and that night, when Daniel invited her to dinner, to align strategies outside the company environment, she accepted. She knew it wasn't just that. And deep down, she wished it wasn't. Dinner with Daniel took place at a restaurant Lucas and Clara often frequented together. This should have given her pause, but it didn't. The conversation flowed easily, and between laughter and glasses of wine, Clara began to feel in control, that she deserved to feel desired. Daniel touched her wrist when she laughed, complimented her on how she handled challenges, and whispered double entendres that she pretended not to hear, but which resonated in her body. When he offered to drop her off, she hesitated for a few seconds. She thought about Lucas, about the house, about dinner the night before, about the coffee he would make the next day. But she also thought about herself. About the emptiness growing inside her. And then she accepted. In the following days, Clara began to move in two directions. During the day, she donned the mask of the exemplary professional. At home, she played the role of the present wife, with an effort that was beginning to take its toll. Lucas, however, began to notice details that had previously gone unnoticed. The different perfume on some nights. The hastily replied messages. The clothes chosen with more care, not for him, but for other eyes. The lack of sparkle in her eyes, the hesitation in her affectionate gestures. He said nothing. But he felt it. Like someone watching a painting slowly being erased and trying, in vain, to save the traces with their own hands. One Friday night, Lucas's parents called and invited him to dinner. With a tightness in his chest, he suggested Clara join them. She smiled with effort, saying she was exhausted and would rather rest. He nodded in understanding, but something inside him was already breaking. However, Clara changed her mind just before leaving. She said she was feeling better and would meet them at the restaurant after taking care of something with work. Lucas thought it was strange but didn't comment. He arrived at the restaurant with his parents, asked for his usual table, and throughout dinner, he kept glancing toward the entrance. He expected to see her at any moment. And he did. But not in the way he imagined. Clara entered the restaurant laughing, her eyes fixed on Daniel, who walked beside her. They were so immersed in each other that they didn't notice their surroundings. Daniel lightly touched her back as he led her to the table, and Clara, without realizing it, was sitting down right within sight of Lucas and his parents. That's when he stood up. He crossed the room with firm steps and stood in front of her. Clara's expression of surprise turned to shock. Daniel immediately recoiled, unsure of what to say. Lucas stared at his wife with a look that held no anger, only disappointment. He said, his voice low and controlled, but full of pain, "What are you doing? You come to dinner with your boss and you don't tell me anything. My parents are at the next table watching all this. I hope you can explain something." Clara froze. For a second, there was no sound. The entire restaurant seemed to have disappeared. Her eyes began to fill with tears, but they wouldn't fall. Her breathing was rapid, her hands trembling, her heart racing. Daniel tried to say something, but Lucas completely ignored him. He returned to the table, finished his wine, smiled tightly at his parents, and said he had to leave. Clara didn't follow him. She just sat there, her body still and her soul in a state of collapse. That night, Lucas arrived home, went to his office, opened the drawer where he kept old documents, and took out the folder containing the marriage contract. Beside it, a blank sheet of paper. He wrote the divorce letter in black ink, without any erasures, with the coolness of someone who expected nothing more. He left it on the living room table, next to the rings, and left with a small suitcase. He didn't take much. Just clothes, documents, and a heart that beat silently, trying to convince itself that it was time to go. Hours later, Clara arrived home and, upon seeing the letter, felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. She sat on the sofa with the sheet of paper in her hands, her face pale, her gaze lost. Her world, which until then had seemed under control, was beginning to crumble. For the first time, she felt the true impact of the choices she had been making. For the first time, she realized she had passed the point of no return. But what Clara didn't yet know was that what would come next wouldn't just be the end of a marriage. There was something much deeper, a revelation yet to be made. Something that would completely change everything she thought she knew about herself, about Lucas, and about the life they had built together. Dawn fell heavy, like the silence inside that empty apartment. Clara sat on the sofa for hours, her eyes fixed on the letter she could no longer read. The dim light from the lamp beside her reflected off the paper, while the world around her seemed frozen in time. The television was off, her cell phone silent, the house impeccably organized, but already lifeless. Lucas's bags were no longer in the hallway, nor was the smell of the coffee he used to make. Nothing remained but the emptiness of a choice that, until then, she had pretended wasn't final. And now it was. In the morning, she tried to get up, but her body felt heavy. Her heart felt crushed. She tried to rationalize the events, as she always did, trying to find logic where there was only feeling. But this time, the justifications wouldn't come. No sentence made sense. No explanation seemed sufficient. In the days that followed, Clara was unable to work. She requested leave, citing exhaustion. She spent hours locked in her room, leafing through old photos, listening to old voicemails, trying to find in the digital records the man she once claimed to love. And the woman she herself had been. He couldn't recognize himself. Not just because of the betrayal itself, but because of what she had let die within herself. She felt like an imposter in her own body, unable to understand how she had allowed everything to fall apart so easily. For the first time, she faced what she had avoided most her entire life, the mirror. And in it, what she saw was not a free, desired, successful woman. She was a woman hollowed out inside, carrying the shards of a love she had destroyed with her own hands. It took weeks for her to work up the courage to seek him out. She discovered, through a mutual friend, that Lucas had moved to another city and started a new life in a small apartment near the center, far from the places they both frequented. The news paralyzed her. He wasn't just hurt. He had chosen not to look back. Still, Clara decided to go to him. She didn't know exactly what she would say. Maybe apologize. Maybe beg for a second chance. Maybe just listen to what he had to say. She wanted to see him. See if his eyes still held anything beyond the pain. When she arrived, she didn't have the courage to knock. She stood across the street, watching the window, waiting for some sign, like a guilt-ridden teenager. Until the building's door opened, and Lucas appeared. He didn't look the same. He wasn't the broken man from the night at the restaurant anymore. There was a lightness in his shoulders, a serenity on his face, as if he had finally found some kind of peace. Clara felt her stomach churn. He was carrying a bag of bread and fruit, walking slowly, fiddling with his cell phone. She crossed the street and called out to him. The name escaped her lips with an almost childlike tremor. Lucas stopped, looked, and for a few seconds, showed no reaction. He just stared at her. His eyes were different. More steady. More distant. Clara approached and tried to smile, but her face was a map of guilt. She said she needed to talk to him, that she couldn't live with that feeling stuck in her chest anymore. Lucas nodded and said he'd accompany her to a nearby cafe. But his expression was neutral, as if accepting out of politeness, not desire. They sat in silence. She didn't know where to begin. He ordered black coffee. She ordered water. And then, after a long minute, Clara opened her mouth. She said she knew what she'd done was unforgivable, that she understood if he didn't want to listen anymore. But she needed to tell him everything. Everything she'd felt. Everything she hadn't said. Everything that had led her to this point. Lucas listened without interrupting. He just stared into space, as if he already knew every word before it was even said. Clara continued, talking about her fears, the constant pressure to be perfect, the desire to feel alive again, and the feeling of losing something inside herself. She cried, but without making a fuss. The tears fell silently, as if each one carried a memory, a mistake, a wrong choice. Lucas then took a deep breath. He said he wasn't there to judge, that he wasn't anyone's judge. But she needed to know something. Something he'd never said. Something he'd kept to himself for a long time, waiting for the right moment. And that moment, painful as it was, had arrived. Clara looked at him in surprise. She thought she'd heard everything. But he continued. He told her that months before everything fell apart, he'd prepared a surprise for her. A gift. A gesture that symbolized the fresh start he so desperately wanted with her. He explained that for a long time, he'd felt Clara was unhappy, distant, confused. And instead of confronting her, he decided to act with love. He said that week when she had that long work trip, he'd traveled too. But not for work. Lucas had gone to collect something special. A process he kept secret because he believed it would be a surprise. He said he spent weeks gathering documents, signing papers, going to appointments. Clara didn't understand. He then took a photo from his pocket and placed it in front of her. It was a picture of a child. A baby. Clara's eyes widened. She couldn't articulate words. Lucas took a deep breath and continued. He said that in the years they were together, he knew she had always been afraid of becoming a mother, but he had always dreamed of starting a family. Not out of pressure, but out of genuine desire. And that when he realized she might never want that, he decided to take another path. Adoption. He said he didn't want to pressure her. That he loved her so much that he was willing to love a child alone, but still, with space for her, should she ever change her mind. Clara trembled. She tried to understand what he was saying. Lucas then revealed that he had started the adoption process months before the separation. He had already met the child. He had already held the baby in his arms. A 6-month-old boy who had been left at a maternity hospital as a newborn. Lucas had fallen in love with that look. And he believed, with all his heart, that Clara might, in her own time, be enchanted too. That's why he hadn't told her before. He wanted to make it a surprise. A gesture of love. A new stage for them both. But when the day came to present everything to her, it was precisely the day he saw her with Daniel at the restaurant. And there, in that moment, everything changed. Clara brought her hands to her face in shock. Tears were now coming in waves. She couldn't contain her tears, nor the pain. The image of the boy before her overwhelmed her. Lucas stared at the table, his eyes watery but tearless. She said that after the separation, she decided to go ahead with the adoption. That the boy was now with him. And that his name was the same one they had once imagined together, during a random conversation, years ago, one early morning. Clara remembered that name. She remembered the conversation. She remembered everything. And she broke down. Lucas then said she wasn't a bad person. But that she had lost her way. That perhaps there was still time to find herself, but that their paths no longer crossed. He said he'd waited for her for years, even when she was no longer there. That he'd tried in every way. But now he had someone who depended on him. Someone who needed the best he could give. And that he could no longer allow himself to live with someone who didn't know the value of true love until he lost it. Clara tried to speak. She said she wanted to meet the boy. That she wanted to be a part of it. But Lucas stood up, paid the bill, thanked her for the conversation, and said that maybe one day, when the boy was older, she could see him. But for now, what he needed most was to protect his son from the instability that once destroyed everything he believed in. And then he left. Without looking back. Clara remained seated, her face in her hands, feeling that in that moment she had lost not only her husband, but the chance for a new beginning. A son he never knew. A love he scorned. And herself. Because more than betraying a man, she had betrayed the woman she claimed to be. And now, all that remained was to live with what she herself chose to destroy. The following week passed in a blur for Clara. She couldn't remember what she had done, what she had eaten, or even what day of the week it was. She would just wake up, pace the house silently, and sit on the living room floor as if waiting for something to happen, but no longer knowing exactly what. Lucas's words echoed like a deafening whisper, repeating in her mind like a curse, the boy's name, the silent adoption, the choice he made out of love, while she destroyed everything on impulse. The image of the son she had never known accompanied her in every gesture, in every corner of the house. It was as if that boy had been there before, waiting for her, and now he was somewhere else, loved and cared for, but not by her. It hurt in a way she had never felt before. It was a pain that was no longer about regret or guilt. It was mourning. For the future that no longer existed. The city felt different. The streets she walked now felt foreign. She entered cafes she used to go to with Lucas and felt the space narrower, colder. The places that had once been scenes of love now overwhelmed her with memories. On impulse, she drove to Lucas's school. She knew he had started teaching architecture again as a volunteer at a local institution. She saw him from afar, outside the gate. He had children sitting around him, explaining something on a makeshift chalkboard. And among them, a small boy, with watchful eyes and a light laugh, who threw himself into his lap with familiarity and affection. It was him. Her son. The boy she'd never dared to desire. Clara put her hand to her mouth, stifled a sob, and left before anyone noticed her. The next day, she received a message from a number she didn't recognize. It was a social worker. The woman said she was in charge of Lucas's adoption case and that he had authorized an informal conversation with Clara, if she wished. Nothing formal, nothing definitive. Just a conversation. Clara answered yes almost without thinking. They arranged to meet in a quiet little square, late in the afternoon. When she arrived, the social worker was already there, with a kind expression. They talked for almost an hour. The woman said the boy was fine, calm, intelligent, and affectionate. That Lucas adored him. She said the process was quick because the boy had already been rejected by 2 couples before, and that Lucas, upon seeing him, said firmly, "That's him. I've waited too long." That hurt more than any accusation. Clara clenched her fingers in her lap and asked if she could meet him someday. The social worker said it would depend on Lucas, and most importantly, on the child. It wasn't a simple decision. But she could write a letter if she wanted. Clara nodded, grabbed a notebook, and wrote there, in silence, for nearly half an hour. She handed the folded sheet to her assistant without rereading it. That was all she could manage for now. In the days that followed, Clara returned to work. He tried to pull himself together, at least on the outside. She wore elegant clothes, smiled in meetings, and maintained a professional tone. But inside, she was different. She'd lost her drive. She started leaving the office early. Returning home, she stared at her own reflection without running away. She started therapy. For the first time in her life, she said out loud that she was afraid of being like her mother. That he'd always thought love meant giving up control. That she'd surrendered to success because she believed she'd only be respected at the top. But the top was cold. And now, all she wanted was a hug that no longer existed. Almost 2 months later, he received a call. It was Lucas. His voice was calm, without hurt. He said he'd read the letter. And that the boy had too. That, with the help of the social worker, he'd read it aloud and asked if the woman in the letter was the girl from the old photos. Clara swallowed hard. Lucas said the boy didn't understand everything, of course, but he was curious. I wanted to know if she also liked playing with cars. And if she knew how to make chocolate cake. Clara smiled through her tears. Lucas then said he'd agree to a date. A brief date, in a park, where the boy could see that the woman in the letter was real. But without expectations, without promises. Clara simply thanked him. Her voice trailed off. And they set a date for Sunday. On Sunday, she arrived early. She wore simple clothes, no makeup. She carried a small children's book with a handwritten inscription. When she saw Lucas approaching with the boy, her heart raced. The boy ran ahead, with joyful energy. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at her curiously, then at Lucas, who nodded. The boy approached shyly. Clara bent down and held out the book. He took it, leafed through it, and said he liked that story. He asked if she could do funny voices like her father. Clara tried to imitate a character, and he laughed. That was it. But in that laugh, something inside her broke again. Something different. It was as if a forgotten part had been touched. After that day, she didn't see the boy again. She didn't ask. She didn't force him. He understood that he needed to rebuild himself first. He continued therapy. She began writing letters to herself, as if talking to the Clara of old, the one who still believed in love, in new beginnings, in forgiveness. She visited her parents, talked to her father after years of estrangement. She apologized to her mother for harboring so much resentment. She took a cooking class. He stopped using his cell phone before bed. He reconnected with old friends. He began living a quieter, more honest life. Lucas, for his part, continued on his way. He taught classes, cared for his son, laughed more. He was a different man. No longer the one who loved Clara, but someone who had learned to love himself. There were still scars, of course. Some pains don't go away, they just change location. But he now knew he was capable of rebirth. And not only that, he was capable of teaching another life to flourish with him. A year after that meeting, the two bumped into each other by chance in a bookstore. It was brief. Clara was choosing a book as a gift for a friend, and Lucas was with the boy, looking for something about dinosaurs. They greeted each other. The boy recognized her and smiled. He said he still had the book she gave him. Lucas smiled back, but there was no long conversation. It wasn't necessary. They simply exchanged a look of mutual understanding. A look that said, there was pain, there was loss, but there was also growth. Clara left the bookstore with a heavy heart, but at peace. She knew she would never get back what she had destroyed. But she also knew she would never again be the woman she once was. And perhaps, in the end, this too would be a form of redemption. Lucas took his son home, prepared dinner, put him to bed, and spent a few minutes watching him sleep. Then he sat on the porch, a book in his hands and a peaceful heart. For the first time in a long time, everything was exactly where it should be. And not by chance. But because he chose to rebuild. Brick by brick. Emotion by emotion. Until, finally, he was able to live again. Without her. And despite her. Clara began to see the world differently after that unexpected reunion at the bookstore. There was no longer despair in her heart, nor the childish desire to return to the past and right mistakes that had already taken their toll. She no longer tried to force rapprochements, nor did she construct dialogues in her mind, imagining excuses or justifications. She accepted where she was, the absence she had caused, the distance that was a direct consequence of her decisions. But even as she accepted it, she felt it. And how she felt it. There were days when she would walk the crowded streets and feel like the only one disconnected from everything. She would watch couples laugh and, for a second, feel envious of things too simple to ask for back. She missed who she had been by Lucas's side. Not the woman who had betrayed him, but the one who still believed in his love as an unshakable certainty. Deep down, she wanted to forgive herself, but that was still an unfinished task. She had moved apartments. She needed to get away from the memories embedded in the walls, from the places where his scent still lingered unexplained. He rented a new, smaller, simpler space, where everything was chosen calmly, without urgency. Now she brought plants into the house, something she previously said she didn't have the patience to care for. She read more. She spoke less. Sometimes she wrote letters she never delivered. Loose texts she left in drawers, as if needing to record what she couldn't yet say out loud. She didn't cry often anymore, but when she did, it was inside. She no longer needed to dramatize to grieve, because the suffering had now settled in a deep, silent part of her soul, where only time could penetrate. Lucas remained steadfast. He devoted himself to his son with almost absolute dedication. Not out of obligation, but because he had discovered a new, pure, unconditional love there. He had learned to care for him, to deal with colic, fevers, and nighttime fears. I knew the names of the boy's favorite characters, the schedules for his cartoons, his favorite ice cream flavors. There were difficult days, yes, especially on those long Sundays when loneliness weighed heavily after the boy fell asleep. But even on those days, Lucas had no regrets. Not because he was a martyr, but because he now understood the value of choices made with a pure heart. And the greatest of them had been letting Clara go. Not because he no longer loved her, but because, to love her, he would have to forget himself, and he was no longer willing to lose himself to anyone again. The dilemma growing within Clara was no longer about getting back together or insisting. It was about what to do with the memory of what she'd experienced. Why do some people make so many mistakes with the people who love them most? Why is it so easy to ignore what you have right in order to pursue an illusion? There was no longer Daniel, no messages, no remnants of what once seemed tempting. It had vanished too quickly, and Clara didn't even feel angry about it. Only indifference. What hurt was the waste. The real chance to have built something whole with someone who, for so long, had been willing to do anything for her. And deep down, she knew, it wasn't about Lucas being perfect. He wasn't. But he was real. Constant. Transparent. Something too rare to be dismissed. And she did. Now, she faced herself every day, trying to understand if she would ever be able to love herself again, even after everything she'd done. One night she returned to the park where she'd first met the boy. It was empty. She sat on the same bench, the cloudy sky above her, the wind cutting through the trees. She remembered his laughter, the way he'd touched her arm curiously, his little voice asking if she could make funny voices. It still echoed like a silent plea for something that could never happen. She couldn't tell if it was longing for what she'd lived or what she'd never had the chance to experience. But it was strong. It was there, present in every gesture, in every breath. She picked up her phone and wrote a message to Lucas. She said she didn't want to ask for anything, nor relive anything. But she wanted to know how the boy was doing. She didn't need to reply, she just wanted to say she wished him well. The message was seen, but not replied to. And she understood. There was no longer room for her in that world. And that, even though it hurt, was fair. Lucas read the message and, for a moment, considered replying. But something inside him told him it wasn't the time. Not out of revenge or resentment. but because there were still wounds that needed to heal in silence. Clara's presence, however discreet, still shook his foundations. The boy spoke of her from time to time. He asked why she wasn't around anymore. Lucas sweetly replied that she was busy with work, but that she sent her regards. It was a way of not harboring resentment. He wanted his son to grow up understanding that sometimes, people don't stay, but that doesn't mean they need to be hated. Absence can teach more than presence, if handled with love. Clara started writing again. This time, not in letters. She began recording her story in chapters. She changed the names, of course. But for the first time, she told everything in detail. Her childhood, the traumas, the encounters, the marriage, the fall, the emptiness, the discovery. Writing was painful, but liberating. It was as if, by putting what she had experienced on paper, she was slowly building a bridge between the woman she was and the woman she could become. She understood that forgiveness, sometimes, doesn't come from others. It comes from within. It comes when you look yourself in the eye and say, I was wrong. But I'm here. And I can still be better. One afternoon, she received an unexpected invitation. It was from the school where Lucas taught. One of the teachers, who knew Clara from a previous event, invited her to give a talk on female leadership in the workplace. She almost declined. But something inside her told her it might be the right time. On the day of the talk, she entered the room with her heart racing. She didn't know if Lucas would be there. Throughout the talk, she remained focused and professional. But at the end, when asked about work-life balance, she took a deep breath and said, sometimes we understand success only after losing everything that truly mattered. The room fell silent. And, in the distance, she saw Lucas entering discreetly through the back door, holding his son's backpack. Their eyes met for a moment. She didn't look away. And neither did he. But this time, there was a different exchange. An acknowledgement without demands. A morning divided into silence. After that day, Clara no longer tried to get closer. She understood that true love also knows when to retreat. Not out of surrender, but out of respect. Respect for the other person's time, for the path they now follow without her. And, above all, respect for the new story that had been built in her absence. Lucas, in turn, began to see her differently. No longer as the woman who hurt him, but as someone who was also trying to rebuild their own life. The hurt had dissolved over time. What remained was a rare kind of compassion. The awareness that two hearts can love each other deeply, and yet no longer belong. And so, with slow steps, each followed their own path. The boy grew, learned, asked fewer questions about Clara. And Lucas guided him with the firmness of someone who had faced the worst and, even so, chosen to love. Clara found new affections, new rhythms. She no longer sought great passions. She sought peace. She sought truth. She sought to look in the mirror and feel that she was, finally, whole. Still with scars, but without shame. Because now, they were part of the journey. And even if their paths never crossed again as before, they both knew, on some level, that they had left eternal marks on each other's history. Not the kind that destroy. But the kind that teach. The kind that show what should never happen again. And also, the kind that reminds us that love, when it's true, doesn't have to be eternal to have been real. In late autumn, the streets began to fill with dry leaves, and the air carried that scent of change that Clara had learned to recognize not only in the seasons, but in her own soul. Her steps were firmer, but the path was still winding. After the school talk, she allowed herself to immerse herself in days of silence, avoiding any impulsive movements that might cause discomfort in Lucas or the child. Respecting the spaces she herself had broken was part of the process of internal reconstruction. It was no longer about winning back, but about understanding that there are loves that, even ending, live on in discreet ways, like a forgotten perfume in an old coat, like a song that plays by chance and makes the heart vibrate, even though time has passed. Clara became involved with an NGO that worked with emotionally vulnerable women. She taught leadership techniques, helped with job interviews, and created therapeutic writing workshops. There, she rediscovered a sense of purpose that wasn't tied to success or image, but to presence. Contact with these women exposed her daily to stories of loss, abuse, and overcoming. And in many of them, she found mirrors. It was as if, by listening to the pain of others, she was gradually recognizing her own with greater dignity. She no longer needed to justify everything she had done. She no longer sought understanding. She simply accepted. And, as much as possible, she transformed what had previously been a burden into care for others. Lucas, on the other hand, was beginning to breathe new possibilities. They weren't romances, nor overwhelming passions, but small encounters, subtle exchanges with people who appeared lightly in his path. A drama teacher from the school where he taught began attending the reading circles he organized on Saturday mornings, and little by little, they began exchanging confidences about literature, childhood, and fears. She was calm, sensitive, and funny. She had a spontaneous way of laughing that effortlessly broke through his defenses. One day, after a school performance, she brought a cake she'd made and left it in the teacher's lounge with a note signed simply with a star. Lucas smiled. He didn't respond. But he kept the note in his wallet. The boy noticed the changes. Children are sensitive to what isn't said. He began to ask less about Clara, but still mentioned the day in the park as if it were a happy memory that needed to be cherished. Lucas encouraged him to keep that memory as something beautiful, without resentment. One night, while putting him to bed, the boy asked if he could see that girl again. Lucas hesitated. He said that perhaps, one day, when everything was calmer, that might happen. The boy then closed his eyes and said that she had sad eyes but a kind smile. Lucas left the room with a heavy heart. Children see what adults hide with words. One rainy Saturday, Clara decided to visit a new bookstore that had opened in a more remote neighborhood. The place was cozy, with sofas, background music, and a small cafe in the back. She sat down to read when she noticed a photo exhibition was about to begin. Unplanned, she stayed. And as she walked past the images, she froze in front of one of them. It was a black and white photo from behind of a man holding a child's hand on a wooden bridge. There were no faces, but she knew it. It was Lucas with the boy. The photographer was a mutual friend who had probably captured it on one of the school outings. That image paralyzed her. Not because of the pain, but because of the poetry. Because of the beauty of something she no longer possessed, but which existed. Which was real. Which was love. She allowed herself to cry silently before that frame, and then walked away. She wrote a small, carefully folded note and left it on the counter to be given to the photographer. The note simply said, "Thank you for reminding me of what love is in its purest form." A few days later, she received a message from that photographer friend. He thanked her for her words, saying that Lucas hadn't known the image would be exhibited, but that upon seeing the note, he'd made a meaningful comment. He said that perhaps he was finally ready to let the past settle where it deserves. Not as a shadow, but as a root. And that perhaps, soon, he'd be willing to talk. Clara read and reread those words cautiously. Not as someone hoping to reconnect, but as someone finding respite after years of drowning. It was a possible peaceful ending. Or a necessary comma. It didn't matter. She just wanted to know she'd left something beyond the pain. The following week, she received a call from Lucas. His voice was different. Still firm, but softer. He said he wanted to talk. Not about the past. Or about reconciliations. But about what each of them had built since the breakup. They arranged to meet at a coffee shop near the old bookstore where it all began. It was a new place for both of them. Neutral territory. When Clara arrived, he was already there, reading a book. Seeing her, he stood and smiled. The hug was brief, respectful. They sat and, for a few minutes, just observed each other in silence. Lucas said the boy was fine, that he now enjoyed drawing dragons and learning difficult words. He said he still remembered Clara fondly, but that he didn't ask her as much anymore. And that was good. It was a sign he had found stability. Clara nodded, moved but restrained. She then talked about her new routine, her work with the NGO, her writing, and what she'd learned. She said she still struggled with ghosts, but now she knew how to deal with them better. Lucas smiled and said he'd always known she had the strength to do it, he just wasn't sure if she'd choose to use that strength correctly. And that, in a way, she was doing so now. The conversation flowed unhurriedly. At one point, Clara asked if he was with anyone. Lucas hesitated for a second and said he was meeting someone, but that it wasn't something grand. Just light. And that, for the first time, that was enough. Clara smiled sincerely. She said she hoped he would be happy. And that he deserved it more than anyone. At the end of the meeting, Lucas handed her an envelope. He said it was a drawing of the boy, done after a class. Clara opened it and saw two figures holding hands, with her name written in crooked letters beside it. It was simple, childlike, but there was an indescribable tenderness. She held the paper as if holding a relic. Lucas then said that this was the last memory he felt was right to share. That the past was now complete. That each of them had done what they could. And that if they ever crossed paths again, they could greet each other as two adults who had outlived themselves. They said goodbye with a longer hug. There were no tears, no promises. Just a comfortable silence between two hearts that had finally learned to say goodbye without having to destroy each other. Clara walked out of the cafe with firm steps, the envelope pressed to her chest. She knew this was the last page of a story. And that the next chapter would be entirely hers. Written with more care. More presence. More truth. And for the first time in a long time, that was all she needed. In the months following that last conversation, Clara came to deeply understand the true meaning of closure. It wasn't about closing doors in anger or ignoring memories, but rather about looking at everything she'd experienced with honesty and accepting the scars as an inseparable part of her own skin. She began to live with more serenity, without the urgency to resolve what was no longer within her control. She learned that some pains don't heal completely, they just settle. And with this awareness, she made one of the most difficult, yet most liberating, decisions of her life, leaving behind not only the story with Lucas, but also the version of herself that kept trying to correct the past. She resigned from the job that still emotionally tied her to the old cycle, sold the possessions that no longer made sense to keep, and moved to a smaller city, where she could start a new job with an organization that sheltered abandoned children. There was something symbolic in this gesture, caring for little ones who had also been left behind, just as she had felt for so long. In her new routine, Clara was a different woman. She no longer needed makeup to hide dark circles under her eyes, nor rehearsed speeches to convince others of her competence. She spoke less, observed more, and listened with empathy to what would previously have seemed banal. She began developing reading and writing projects for her children, teaching them to write letters as a way of expressing themselves. Those letters, often addressed to absent parents or imaginary versions of themselves, became a constant mirror for her. Each time she read one, she felt closer to her inner child, the one who once dreamed of love and, out of fear, destroyed the only true love she had ever found. But she also learned that we are not just our mistakes. We are what we choose to do with them. Meanwhile, Lucas continued his journey with a tranquility he long believed he would never achieve. His son grew up with remarkable health and intelligence. He was sensitive, curious, and had an instinctive ability to perceive others' feelings. Lucas knew part of this stemmed from the loving environment he had managed to build, even after so much suffering. He spent his weekends enjoying picnics, movie nights at home, and visits to the local library, where he loved choosing books about dragons, spaceships, and crazy inventions. Over time, his relationship with his drama teacher deepened. It wasn't an overwhelming love like the one he experienced with Clara, but it was solid, light, and companionable. It was the kind of love that grows over time, with shared silence, with the certainty that both were ready to care, not to patch things up. One spring afternoon, Lucas decided to write a letter to Clara. He didn't expect a reply. It wasn't an attempt at rapprochement. It was simply a gesture of humanity. He told her about the boy's growth, his new habits, and how he still kept the book she had given him. He said he was fine, that he had forgiven everything, including himself, and that he hoped she had done the same. At the end of the letter, he wrote a phrase Clara had said in a long-ago conversation: "We only understand the depth of love when we learn to let go." And in that moment, she cried like she hadn't cried in a long time. Not with pain, but with peace. Life went on. Clara opened a small publishing house focused on emerging authors with stories of overcoming adversity. She published a book with fictional accounts based on her experiences, but never revealed that they were hers. The book gained traction among readers who saw themselves represented in its pages, and soon, she began receiving letters of gratitude from people who found solace and inspiration in her narrative. From that moment on, she understood that, despite the destruction she had caused, she was still capable of rebuilding, not what she had lost, but something new, greater, and perhaps even more meaningful. She wouldn't erase her story with Lucas, nor did she want to. It was part of her emotional foundation. But now, there was room for new stories, new affections, and above all, for full self-acceptance. Lucas, in turn, cemented his relationship with his teacher. Together, they decided to formally adopt the boy as their son. It was a simple ceremony, with few guests, but filled with emotion. At the end of the hearing, the boy ran to them and said he now felt complete. That night, Lucas looked up to the sky and, in his mind, thanked everything that made him suffer. Because only after the pain was he able to see what he truly deserved. He realized that happiness isn't found in the permanence of people, but in the ability to love even knowing that everything is finite. And that the most lasting love is the one that doesn't demand anything in return, but that transforms. Time passed, and one night, at a talk Clara gave at a book fair, she was surprised by a question from the audience. A teenager, with intense eyes, asked how she dealt with regret. Clara paused for a moment, took a deep breath, and replied, "I don't deal with it. I've learned to live with it. Like a scar. I look at it, remember the pain, but I also see how much I've grown since. Regret teaches me every day to make different choices." The audience fell silent. And then gave a standing ovation. Not for the spectacle, but for the raw truth that came from someone who learned, the hard way, that cheating doesn't just destroy the other person, it destroys what's most pure within ourselves. This story shows us that betrayal is like a stone thrown into the center of a calm lake. The ripples it creates spread far and wide, reaching places we never imagined. It destroys homes, breaks trust, and erases glances that were once refuges. More than losing the love of another, those who betray lose something they can never fully recover, their own peace. Clara had to rebuild her soul with her bare hands, brick by brick, after being swallowed by guilt. Lucas had to relearn to love without fear, and he only succeeded because he chose to care, not to seek revenge. And the boy, a living symbol of consequences and new beginnings, grew up between two worlds that touched and drifted apart, but never ceased to teach him that true love doesn't lie, doesn't betray, doesn't abandon. True love endures, even when it must leave. If you've made it this far, with a heavy heart and a touched soul, we want to know what you thought of this story. Leave a comment, tell us what you felt, what you learned, what made an impact on you. Your opinion is very important to us. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now so you don't miss stories as profound as this one. And remember, here on this channel, we do not support, defend and never romanticize any type of betrayal. Our stories are fiction, but the pain they portray is too real to ignore. May each of them serve as a warning, a mirror, and, above all, a lesson. Because cheating is never just a passing choice. It's a breaking point that sometimes has no return. And when it does, it's almost never the same way.